The crypt's downward ramp reaches out before our heroes as we pick up in the cliffside cemetery. Wary of traps, they slowly begin to descend, lighting their torches and lanterns. Scattered bones litter the floor, and a central, suspicious skid mark leads the way. The group is hesitant to move on, sensing a dreadful aura to the structure. But their presence catches the attention of 5 otherworldly lights on the surface. As the hovering lights approach, a cacophony of their horrific voices can be heard inspiring the group to close the entrance of the crypt behind them and hastily hurry down the ramp. The bottom of the ramp opens into a large ossuary of intricately decorated bones and skulls. Ever the learners, Blywyn and Krigdor begin investigating the remains dating the bones to 70 years prior, corresponding to a historical mass death in Baldur's Gate, and incidentally, around the inception of the Church of Kelemvor. Judaiah, admiring the apparent dwarven architecture of the crypt, finds 6 skeletal forms shackled to the walls. Seemingly, these were more recently placed murdered victims. On their person, Judaiah finds a small bag of humanoid tokens. This investigation is cut short by the lights of the wisps shining through the door's gaps and holes. The beings easily begin phasing through the door itself. Scrambling, the party begins piling any skulls they find with silver fillings at the entrance of the ossuary, forming a crude barrier. However, their confidence in this protective barrier is not shared by Octai. He borrows Judaiah's cooking kit and pours a line of salt across the inside of the silvered barrier, remembering an old wives' tale from his childhood. The group backs up further into the ossuary, bracing themselves for a battle with a foe they know not if they can defeat. However, when the wisps come to the barrier, they scream in pain and retreat back up the ramp, leaving the group safe for now. 2 passages lead further into the crypt, one downward and one to the left around a corner. Just then, a crash of bone can be heard in the darkness ahead, and a skittering of a creature can be heard retreating around the corner to the left. After a brief discussion, the group decides to follow the skid marks on the floor to the downward passage. They are met with the macabre sight of the remains of a storm giant filling the room. A small passage to the left leads to the pewter remains of countless bodies piled high in a drain, and in the distant corner, beyond the giant skeleton, cowers a gaunt, sinewy creature. The group corners the beast and questions it, finding its name to be Jerry. They are able to derive a great deal of information from Jerry. It reveals that it is of the Magnic people, and it came to Baldur's Gate 11 years ago, and that its people are typically slaves of the Red Wizards. Additionally, the group surmises that the storm giant must have come from the region of Anarek. Finally, Jerry tells the group the strange skull-faced men began appearing in his crypt a few moons ago. Immediately, the party recognizes this to be the Cult of Bane, and as a precaution, Korgrim and Judaiah sabotage some magical runes on the skeleton's hip bone, an assurance that its form won't reanimate by any magical means. Suddenly, the investigation is cut short when the voices of Bane's acolytes can be heard reverberating down the ramp and growing louder in their direction. The group ducks into a side room with all the corpses with Jerry in tow. Jerry insists they make an escape by pushing through the drain of bodies, but the group holds firm, waiting to spy on their foes. Octai plants his newly acquired tower shield to the side of the entrance into the corpse room, and the group braces themselves. A group of acolytes descend the ramp into the storm giant room, talking amongst themselves when Korgrim conjures the illusion of a heavy fog, filling the large portion of the room and plunging the acolytes into a murky crypt fog. Not to be one to miss an opportunity, Krigdor creeps into the mist, outflanking the enemy and lying in wait. As the acolytes speak on the oddity of the crypt fog, one of them calls out, suspicious of interlopers, but is interrupted by the sound of Krigdor cutting the neck of one of his men, and the sound of a bolt blindly shot from Korgrim's scavenged hand crossbow into the group. Pandemonium breaks out as the acolytes shout and call out for their hidden foes to come out and fight. They brush against Krigdor and strike wildly into the mist, landing a glancing blow on the hidden tabaxi. Meanwhile, in the corpse room, the rest of the party begin landing devastating hits on the acolytes as they charge into the area. Judaiah and Octai land effective hits on the men until a blood-soaked burlap sack is thrown into the melee and lands at Blywyn's feet. A ghastly form of a skeletal ghoul forms and grapples with Blywyn. This draws Octai off the front line as he pulls the monster off his friend and wrestles it to the ground. Meanwhile, Blywyn begins casting spells to put the acolytes to sleep, incapacitating some of them. A fire starts in the corner, and an acolyte is pushed into it, lighting him ablaze. Judaiah begins losing ground as he is pushed back, and subsequently plunged into a magical darkness by one of the men. In an effort to disarm the magic users, Octai pins one of them to the wall with climbing pitons, appearing to crucify one of them at first glance, but this unintentionally does kill the man. A last survivor attempts an escape, but is stopped and brought back in by a swift creek door. The group attempts to question the man. Octai threatens that the man will meet the same fate as his crucified friend. This threat, intending to be only that, is convincing to the entire group with the exception of Blywin. However, the acolyte in a frenzy bites out his own tongue. This sends the group into an argument about what to do with the man, and during this time Octai is landing blow after blow on the man, attempting to render him unconscious. As the bickering continues to a head, Korgem climbs onto the man's back and cuts his throat. A long silence follows as the group begins coming to terms with what has just happened. A dark shadow falls over their hearts. The ethics of what has been done is discussed, and frustrations are given words. The ambient noise of the chambers echoed loudly as the group presses forward in silence. Sitting on the storm giant remains, Octai solitarily reflects on his life. As he stares off into the darkness, Jerry perches next to Octai. During their conversation, Jerry's simple perspective on life saddens Octai, as he finds himself envious of his naive friend. Shortly after, the group reconvenes in the front chamber, outlining a contingency plan to collapse the chamber. Leaning into his dwarven masonry knowledge, Judaiah begins to configure a method to carry out the group's plan. In these spare moments, the group realize they neglected what Jerry calls the summoning room. Judaiah places the final touches on his combustibles, and the group moves into the unknown room. Proceeding through a small corridor, the ceiling sweeps upward into a large vacant room. Jerry lingers behind, anxiously watching the dark ceiling. The vast room contains a central altar surrounded by 4 columns. 2 corpses adorn the altar. After some investigation, the group determines the corpses were phlebotomized. Additional findings from Korgem and Blywin reveal that the altar has additional symbols, in the same position as hours of a clock, correlating to coordinates. These discoveries lead the party to surmise that the blood of innocents activates the altar. Blywin questions Jerry, asking if he's seen where the portal leads to. Jerry describes a sword high up on a hill. Uncertain of what Jerry is describing, the group dismisses this information's importance. Octai keenly observes movement in the darkness overhead, and begins inspecting the source by climbing a pillar. Swooping down, a blur attempts to attack Octai, who dodges and inadvertently causes a portion of the wall to cave in as he swings out from the wall and brings the hidden beast to the floor. At this time, the group is ambushed by a group of poisonous imps and further cave-ins. Octai uses the shield on his back to protect Blywin and himself from the stones. Korgem, Kriegdor, and Judaiah are attacked and struggle as the beasts puncture them with their lethal barbed tails. The group begins making headway, fighting the creatures, until Korgem projects a deceptive facsimile of Balok's voice, demanding the creatures cease their inappropriate assault on their supposed allies. The imps speak to each other, until Octai steps forward, garbed in Balok's armor, and demands they fall into line in the Infernal language. With the short-term telepathy of Korgem's message ability, the group coordinates a synchronized coup de grace in an attempt to seal the altar with demon blood. However, instead of sealing the portal, it opens, drawing the group into its depths. The party finds themselves in a fiery hellscape. Before them lie the rocky battlefield of Avernus, the first level of hell, as a battle is in its fever pitch. Demons are charging towards an enormous magical sword, plunged into a lava pit halfway up its blade. Behind them, a demonic commander wielding an exotic whip shouts orders. The image is a lot to take in for the group as they begin picking themselves up, and Octai begins screaming. The essence of Pazuzu forces its way out of Octai's body and begins to form before him, towering over the group. The firstborn is made manifest, leaving an exhausted shell of a Goliath behind him to collapse to the sulfuric surface. As soon as he materializes, Pazuzu, the malefactor, pulls the enormous Hellblade from the pit and takes ultimate command of the demonic forces surrounding him. An overwhelming sense of dread comes over the group as they are frozen in fear, and the demonic commander they witnessed when they entered screams in anguish and retreats. Barely comprehending the events unfolding before them, Octai is met once again with Pazuzu's gaze as he speaks.
Oh, Octai, you have done what I could not. Returned me to my home. I would usually begin disemboweling you and your friends now, but I am grateful. And I have many things that demand my attention. I am a generous lord, and so you may leave to find your family.
Images and sounds fill Octai's mind as he gains the knowledge of his family's whereabouts. And with a raised hand, Pazuzu activates the portal and the group finds themselves once again at the crypt, strewn on the floor. The altar crumbles into dust and reveals a passageway beneath as the group begins stirring. The party begin helping each other, with Octai appearing strangely refreshed. He appears less bulky and slightly shorter, with a face that seems to have de-aged 10 years, and an unfamiliar smile on his face as he proclaims a miracle's happened. Blywyn finds herself in a deep despair, fearing for the fate of the world. Krigdor puts himself into care mode, masking his own concern as he tends to the group. Korgum appears almost catatonic, and Judaiah is physically sickened by what has happened. Voices can be heard echoing up from the hidden passageway, and the crypt begins caving in. In the state that they are in, the group decides a hasty retreat would be prudent, but not before Krigdor and Octai pull a pillar down onto the passageway, and Judaiah detonates the explosives he has planted earlier. As the group emerges from the crypt, Blywyn sounds the Goliath warhorn and is met by Neris, following suit until she appears from the darkness with Beetle and the horse-drawn wagon. The group climbs aboard and escapes the graveyard grounds as the Wisps attempt a short-lived pursuit. The ride back is mostly silent, each member of the group in their own heads. The only sound to be heard are the deep breaths of the horses, Neris's reins, and the sound of the wheels rolling over dirt and rocks as the group travels back to the Church of Kelemvor.